Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. It's an honor and a privilege to be addressing a galaxy of brilliant members of the faculty and potentially brilliant students. And I do hope that today's, it's a series of provocations really to you to rethink our conventional ideas of development and the way we have been designing development policy. So I do hope that through this interaction between us, the faculty, and the students, the great potential which all of you represent here will be actualized, will flower and blossom, and to be able to build a better future both for humanity as a whole and for Pakistan in particular. What I hope to show in this very brief discussion is that we are in a sense at a turning point in the history of the modern world, and also at the same time in the history of human knowledge as it has emerged over the last 3 centuries. At this historic juncture is defined in terms of 3 challenges which confront human society at the global, regional, as well as national levels. Now, what I hope to do very briefly is to first identify each of these challenges, talk about them very, very briefly, and then go on to show how in addressing these challenges, our concepts of development are in the process of change. And therefore, the way we design development policy is also going to have to change. So in a sense, we're living at a thrilling moment in the history of the world, in that everything is in the melting pot. New ideas are emerging, new ways of doing things are emerging, and the central challenge is to give up the baggage of the past, to relearn in the context of the challenges that are ahead of us, and to be able to design forms of public action and public policy through which we can overcome these challenges. In a sense, the very survival of the human species, one can argue, is predicated on addressing challenges and innovating in the face of these challenges. After all, when human life first began on this planet, as a Cambridge anthropologist once put it, we had a 50-50 chance of survival. We didn't have any hair to cover our bodies. We were weak. The only thing we had was the capacity to think for ourselves. And that's what saved the day. In a sense, we are partly because of the trajectory of technological change that has taken place, partly as a result of the way we relate with goods, with nature, and indeed with each other. Because of these developments in human society and in human attitudes, we are once again facing a threat. And this time it's a threat not just to the survival of the human species, but indeed a threat to life itself on this planet. And so we better put our act together and start thinking and innovating. And that's the kind of thing you're supposed to learn at a university. So let's make a beginning here. First, the environmental crisis. You see, what has happened here, and this has come to the surface since the mid-1980s, but much more sharply with the publication of the 4th assessment report of the UN's Intergovernmental Panel for Climatic Change. What this new corpus of literature, scientific literature, has shown is that global warming, 2 things basically. Global warming is indeed occurring, and that firstly, and secondly, that this global warming is the result of the way human beings have intervened into the planet's ecosystem in the process of production, consumption, and disposal of waste. although much attention is being paid to the phenomenon of global warming and climate change, at the same time there are other serious degradation threats to the life support systems of the planet, and these include the degradation of the hydrologic systems, surface water and groundwater degradation, pollution of the air that we breathe, and pollution of the soils which produce our food. And therefore, in a sense, the very life support systems of the planet, air, water, soils, food, are under threat. So now attention has been focused much more sharply on this question of climate change, which is occurring as a result of global warming. And the one consequence from the point of view of the present discussion, the central consequence of all this, is that it has increased the intensity and frequency of extreme climatic events. So you have more intense floods than before, but also more intense droughts than before. You have hurricanes which are much more devastating than before. And all these natural adverse phenomena are occurring, not only are they more intense, but they're occurring more frequently. Now, in the case of Pakistan, unfortunately, the particular region that we are located in, South Asia, is particularly vulnerable to the effects of climate change. And the main cause of all this, this vulnerability, is that something like 65% of Pakistan's population is dependent on agriculture, and agriculture is critically dependent on the timeliness and magnitude of precipitation during the monsoons. Now, what climate change has done is that it has increased the variability in both the timing of the monsoons as well as the quantum of precipitation. And therefore, the lives of millions of people have been adversely affected, and we'll see how. Just to give you an idea, in the Pakistani case, just the 2010 floods alone, that's just one event, and there's been a number of floods and droughts, one after the other over the last decade. 3,000 deaths in just 1 year, affecting 20 million people at a cost of $25.32 billion. As I said, we are more vulnerable than perhaps any other part of the world to climate change. In terms, can you close that door, please? In terms of the international ranking of vulnerability, Pakistan stands at the 5th highest in the ranking. Pakistan stands at the 5th highest in the ranking for vulnerability to climate change effects. Now, what this has done is that it has, because of this variation in the timing of the rainfalls and the quantum of the rainfalls during monsoons, it has increased the instability of agriculture production, particularly in Pakistan. And so what happens is that both the frequency as well as the amplitude of these fluctuations has increased. And that means that at the bottom end of the production of the cycle, during bad harvest, the intensity and frequency of bad harvests have increased, which means that there is a built-in tendency now for the small farmers and the poor peasants to be pushed into poverty. Because when there is a bad harvest, they're forced to borrow money for food, and once they go into debt, they're unable to reconstitute the production cycle the following year, and they therefore go into kind of immiserization or impoverishment as a result of this increased instability of agriculture output. But the other equally worrying thing that is in the process of taking place is that with the existing seeds, the kinds of seeds that are already in use in Pakistan and also much of South Asia, these seeds, grain seeds, are highly vulnerable to increased temperatures. And the IPCC, this UN body which produced that famous report, the fourth assessment report, has estimated that if average temperatures increase by 2.5 degrees centigrade, there could be a 30% reduction in the yields per acre of major crops. God forbid if that happens. If we are unable to rise to the challenge and develop new and heat-resistant varieties of food grains, then we are talking about major food shortages in this country, and also perhaps in the rest of South Asia. Overall, if you look at the species extinction rate, which is a good index of the fact that our forms of social life, the technologies we're using, the forms of production and waste disposal are constituting a major threat to the survival of all creatures. And the latest estimate is that something like 2,000 species are going extinct every year. Now the natural extinction rate, that is the extinction rate which prevailed before the onset of industrialization, was only 2 species a year. So there has been a 1,000 times increase in the pace at which species are dying. And if other species are under threat, certainly at some point the human species is also going to be under serious threat if we allow things to continue. The latest science has told us, and this came out very sharply in the Paris summit, and more recently it was brought out by the UN Secretary General as he retired just a few days ago, that if the average global temperatures increase by more than 2 degrees centigrade by the end of the century, then we're really in uncharted terrain. We could be entering a period when there could be catastrophic imbalances and catastrophic disasters related with instability in the world's atmosphere and physical environment. So really it's a critical situation. And this critical situation, as in the early stages of human life on this planet, requires us to rethink, to innovate, to find solutions to problems. The second great challenge that faces the world today, this is something that some of us who were doing research back in the 70s and 80s had pointed out, but we were on the margins of social science, not the mainstream. And so a few people took notice of the work that I had done and a few of my colleagues at Cambridge and then Sussex had done about inequality, but now it's hitting everybody in the face. Inequality has become a major threat to the stability of societies and to the economic potential of various economies. What is the nature of this inequality? What is the magnitude of this inequality? And if you just quickly look at the figures, you'll understand why people are getting so worried and why social scientists and economists should also get worried and start seriously thinking about how to address this problem of inequality. In this year, the latest estimates are that the richest 1% of the population has as much wealth as the rest of the world combined. To look at the extremes, while a small number of people are living a life of incredible luxury, flying around in jets, private jet aircrafts and yachts, 15 people are dying every minute somewhere in the world, which means that by the time we finish this 1-hour discussion, 90 more people will have starved to death or died due to starvation-related illnesses. 1 out of 9 people on this planet do not have enough food to lead a healthy and active life at a time when about 1 billion people at the top are suffering from diseases related with obesity. So So you have these extremes of inequalities of income and wealth, which are placing a pressure not just on the social fabric and creating the conditions for violence, but also, as we are now discovering, some of us, it is also a suppression of the economic potential of countries. Because if you have such a large number of people, children suffering from malnutrition, such a large number of people facing starvation and inadequate diet, then their potential to develop as human beings, as productive human beings and contributing to the economy and society is obviously also restricted. So in that sense, this inequality is a restriction both on the economic potential as well as a stress on the very fabric of societies. Unfortunately, the one picture that my dear research assistants and program officer has found is rather painful. Violence, which sort of based on militant extremism. This is a picture of the APS. In Pakistan, while terrorism and militant extremism is now a worldwide phenomenon, it's happening in most countries of the world, of the Western world as well as the Eastern part of the world, Pakistan has faced between 2000 and 2016 levels of terrorism which were unprecedented until the explosion in the Middle East. 61,000 people died, over 61,000 people died, and at an economic cost of $118 billion for a small, poor country. The other theater of this extremist violence is Syria. In the case of Syria, in the period 2010 to 2015, just 5 years alone, 400,000 deaths have been brought about, causing millions of people to be displaced from their homes and becoming refugees. And a more poignant, perhaps palpable index of this terrible human tragedy is that the life expectancy in Syria has dramatically declined from over 70 years in 2010 to only 55 years in 2015. Okay, I'll now speak about the challenge to the social sciences and therefore the challenge to each of us to rethink our subjects in social sciences and indeed in the natural sciences as well, insofar as you study to be able to learn how to innovate. It's a challenge for all of us, right? And that is this issue of the environmental crisis. Now, the concept that emerged in the late 1980s under the auspices of Prime Minister Mrs. Brundtland, who headed a World Commission on Environment and Development. It was the first UN body tasked to look into the crisis of the environment. And I had the privilege and honor of working briefly with her on this. And the concept that she developed, or the Commission developed, was called sustainable development. Now, as I had pointed out at the time, when we understand this concept, as I just explained to you, those of you who are doing economics or social sciences would understand that this concept, in a sense, overthrows in many ways or undermines the basic postulates on which the science of economics or modern economic theory is based. How do you define sustainable development? Or how did she define social development as sustainable development? Sustainable development is that development which enables the present generation to fulfill their needs without undermining the capacity of future generations to fulfill their needs. Now, if that is the way you look at development in terms of sustainable development, and that report, the first, that pioneering report, Our Common Future, pointed out that if we continue to proceed in the same fashion, i.e. maintain the trajectory of technological change that had emerged since the Industrial Revolution, and if we continue to focus on private profitability-based growth processes without regard to what's happening to the environment, then indeed the very ecosystem and the life support system of the planet would be undermined. And that, if that happens, then even economic growth will not be sustainable apart from the threat to human life. So therefore, if you look at sustainable development in these terms, that it is that development which enables the present generation to fulfill its needs without undermining the capacity of future generations to fulfill their needs, then, ladies and gentlemen, the science of economics is in trouble. Because the two basic postulates of what is the mainstream economic theory, neoclassical theory, is predicated on is firstly the idea that social welfare, or the maximum good of the maximum number, can be achieved if each individual in isolation from other individuals attempts to maximize his or her material satisfaction. Well, what this definition is saying, sustainable development is saying, is that actually individuals are not isolated. They don't pursue welfare in isolation, from that there is a high degree of interdependence between individuals. And that indeed this interdependence is accompanied by a sense of responsibility towards other people. That is why we have to so use our ecosystem, so use our natural environment, that we don't undermine the capacity of future generations to fulfill their needs. So in other words, we feel responsible to the future generation. So that's the first, I think, major consequence which economics has yet to fully come to grips with in terms of its theory and analysis. The second interesting postulate, which is in a sense overthrown by this particular idea of sustainable development, is that is the idea of equity, basically. It is that if you're worried about future generations yet to be born, if you're concerned about them, then ipso facto it follows that you should be concerned about the plight of the present generation, people who are living side by side with you. So therefore, you can't have such acute inequality where some people are so rich that they're flying around in aircraft, private aircraft, and that 90 people are dying every 1 hour due to starvation. You owe something to even the present generation. And therefore, as I've been arguing, Mrs. Brundtland's conception of sustainable development shows very clearly that human beings are interdependent and therefore responsible towards each other. And secondly, that equity is built into the concept of sustainable development. That's the point I was trying to argue in Bonn earlier on when they were formulating these, the UN was formulating this Sustainable Development Goals agenda. That, you know, this business of reducing inequality is not just a fashion. I mean, it is inherent to the very concept of sustainable development, which drives our attempt to save the planet. We've got to not only save the planet, but at the same time save people from unnecessary suffering who are living at this particular juncture. That's built into this. Okay, now we look at the question, the second challenge, and it's the implications of that challenge for the way we understand development and the way we design development policy. And that is the challenge of inequality. I don't have many slides, so please look at me. Don't look at this. This is done and over with. Inequality. Now you'll find it interesting, those of you who do economics particularly, but even those who don't do economics, those who just read newspapers and have been doing so over the years, will know that there was a time when the mainstream belief was that it's all right to have inequality. In fact, inequality is good for growth. And the idea there was that if you have some people are very, very rich, then as the rich become richer, they save more, because the assumption was that only the rich can save and invest. And so if the rich save and invest more, you'll have a higher rate of economic growth. So in a sense, inequality was thought to be good for growth, at least in the early stages. And then, of course, Simon Kuznets came along with his famous American Economic Review paper of 1955, I think it was, the 1955 paper, in which he presented the following rather comforting graph. Now, what this graph shows you, and he claimed to have estimated this graph on the basis of the empirical data available at the time, cross-country as well as time series. And he said, look folks, when you have low rates of economic growth, when you have low per capita incomes, and you try to increase your per capita income, inequality will happen. That's good for you. But as your per capita incomes rise beyond a certain, your inequality will first taper off, like here, and then your inequality will begin to decline. This graph shows on the y-axis the level of inequality, the index for inequality, and on the x-axis per capita income growth rates. So beyond a certain level of per capita incomes, he predicted that your inequality will decline through market forces. So this belief in the market system, in first making use of inequality by generating growth, and then reducing inequality by some automatic market mechanism, was a reassuring sort of view for social scientists. And of course, in Pakistan, we have a tendency not to be skeptical about the theory and the views that are presented to us from the West. We take them and we swallow them as they are. It's another sign of not being able to think for ourselves. Anyway, unfortunately, 1955 was this Kuznets paper, and in the mid-50s, around the same time, we began our endeavor to have high rates of economic growth. And you find when you look at the literature, I'm doing a book on this, so I've had the misfortune of actually coming across statements made by the Planning Commission in the planning documents of the following kind. It was believed, like in Kuznets, that there is a functional justification for inequality of income if this raises production for all. And Dr. Mahbub al-Haq, for whom, God bless his soul, for whom I have great respect, because he then rethought, and he was the first to admit the mistake he'd made, and he made major contributions subsequently to development economics. My hats off to him, and he was a mentor of mine, so I have great respect and regard for him. Now, the third five-year plan assiduously followed the Kuznets-in view, and their design of public policy, you'll be astounded. But this was the fashion of the season. This is what Harvard and MIT and other universities were telling us. That fashion was transfer incomes from the poor to the rich, because it's the rich who have a higher marginal propensity to save. And so by transferring income, by designing policies that actually make the poor poorer and the rich richer, you will have higher rates of investment and higher rates of economic growth. Now that was the very design of the policy. So therefore, we should not be surprised at the fact that at the end of the 1960s, a small number of people became incredibly rich, but the majority of the people suffered an absolute decline in their living standards. And it was Dr. Haq who blew the whistle, with all respect. I mean, one has to honor him for being intellectually honest. And when he realized it made a big boo-boo, and actually looked at the data at the end of the 1960s, he was the first to blow the whistle and said 22 families now control 66% of industrial assets. Only 22 families were controlling 66% of industrial assets. What he also, what other people then revealed was that by contrast, the bottom 60% of the urban population, as well, and to a greater extent the rural population, but the bottom 60% of the urban population had suffered an absolute decline in the per capita food consumption. यानी जितना खाना खाते थे per capita, grain consumption जो थी, per capita, for the 60% of the people had declined during this period that was held up as a great success story in terms of high growth. We, of course, generated a GDP growth rate of something like 6.9% annually. But underlying this growth rate was this great inequality. Not only was there interpersonal inequality of high magnitudes, but also there was inter-regional inequality. Inequality between West and East Pakistan, which is what was seen at that particular time. And in this decade of high growth, 1960s, the growth rate of GDP of East Pakistan was about 1/3 that of West Pakistan. East Pakistan was growing at 1.5%, West Pakistan was growing at 3.6+%. By the end of the 60s, the per capita income in East Pakistan was about 42%, almost 50% lower than the per capita income of West Pakistan. Now, these two kinds of economic disparities were not just academic disparities for us to look at statistically, they had very real political consequences. The disparities between the rich and the poor triggered a popular movement against Ayub Khan in West Pakistan. You're too young to have seen it, or some of you are too young to have seen it, but you must have read it. I was on the streets at that time in the 1960s against Ayub Khan. The rich-poor divide triggered that popular movement, and it overthrew the very political system within which that high-growth miracle had taken place. Whereas the disparities between East and West Pakistan fueled a popular nationalist movement in East Pakistan, which ended in the tragedy of separation and the emergence of the independent state of Bangladesh. So Pakistan lost more than half its population in that other province. And therefore, I think Pakistan is held up as one of the rather more dramatic cases of what happens if you allow disparities to grow in this particular fashion and you build in disparities into your public policy. Much to learn. But we didn't. We did not learn the lessons of this traumatic disaster. We continued more or less with the same policies, and the situation today is just as bad as it was at the time East Pakistan broke up and the Ayub Khan's democratic system was overthrown. My research assistant Nazif Ishtiyaq and I have made an estimate that's based on World Bank data but adjusted for tax evasion, which the World Bank has not taken into account. And if you adjust the World Bank data for tax evasion, you come up with a figure that 0.1% of the richest population, part of the population, 0.1% of the population amongst the richest has a per capita monthly income of about $1 million rupees, over $1 million rupees, more than 10 lakhs. Whereas the bottom 60% of the people have a monthly income of less than 6,000 rupees per head. So this vast gap between the majority of the people, the way the majority of the people live, and a very small minority at the top is as dramatic as it was at the end of the 60s. Worse, the regional disparities are just as bad, if not worse. First, you had regional disparities. People were looking at regional disparities between East and West Pakistan, but Naved Hamid and I did a research paper on disparities within West Pakistan, and they were just as bad. But nobody took notice of intra-West Pakistani disparities until now, when the only country we have is what was then West Pakistan. And here we have in Pakistan today, if you look at it in terms of multidimensional poverty, now multidimensional poverty is more than calorific norms. It's to do with access over education and various standards of living and so on. 38.8% of Pakistan's population, more than 1/3, is still in poverty. And there are acute inter-district inequalities. For example, the poverty in Lahore is only 4.3%. The incidence of poverty in terms of multidimensional poverty is only 4.3%, whereas that in Qilla Abdullah in Balochistan is almost 97%. So look at the gap in the incidence of only 4.3% in Lahore and 97% in a district in Balochistan, Qilla Abdullah. Very few of us have even heard of that district, but that's what the situation is. Now, don't be surprised if there is a political reaction to that disparity. Okay, so now going back to how we address the crisis of each of these dimensions of the crisis: sustainable development, the inequality problem, and other challenges. I've described to you the problem of sustainable development, which presents a challenge to follow development policies, public policies, growth policies, which take into account both the protection of the environment and at the same time which allow and enable greater equity to take place, greater equality to take place in the economy and society. So the new concept that is now emerging, and we've just finished a paper, a major report for Pakistan on inclusive, in which Dr. Bashir Ahmed was one of our co-authors, on inclusive and sustainable development. And incidentally, for Dr. Ramzan, this is one of the first reports at operationalizing the Sustainable Development Goals agenda of the UN, the first country report since the thing was launched. So inclusive and sustainable development is the route to follow as far as the question of sustainability is concerned. On the question of inequality, very interestingly, new research has emerged which is turning the traditional wisdom on its head. You see, the traditional wisdom told us that inequality is good for growth, at least in the initial stages. Now we've discovered from a whole range of authors, based on empirical data, the first major kind of seminal work that was produced only 2 years ago was by Thomas Piketty. I think he's going to get the Nobel Prize at some point. Thomas Piketty produced this landmark book 2 years ago called Capital, in which he has shown, on the basis of more than 100 years of data in a number of different countries, that Kuznets' curve that I've shown you earlier is just a fantasy. It's a fairy, he calls it a fairy story. And the actual data shows that far from inequality declining, that in fact inequality has been persistently increasing over the last 1 century. And if you want to reduce inequality, you've got to have public action. You've got to intervene into markets. You can't let markets to operate on their own, because if you do, you're going to have continuing increases in inequality. So that was Piketty. Then came along a whole range of authors, Atkinson, Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize winner, Easterly, a whole range of authors, just in the last few years, have shown that in fact inequality is not good for growth. Inequality is not good for growth either, as Kuznets had believed. In fact, Nazif and I did a cross-country time series study of about 130 countries for data for about 20 years, which showed that the higher the level of inequality, the lower the long-term economic growth of the country was. So Atkinson and Easterly, these guys are quite right. There is massive empirical evidence to demonstrate that inequality is a constraint to growth. And if you think about it, it's a commonsensical analysis that one has made, is simply that if you exclude the majority of the people from the process of investment, productivity increase, innovation, competition, then obviously you're going to have a slower rate of economic growth compared to a situation where most of the people have an opportunity to invest and be productive and be innovative. Now, in a sense, that's turning the traditional wisdom on economics on its head. Now we have to argue that to generate growth and sustainable growth, you've got to have equality. And that's why in this paper I did 2 years ago, I argued that equity is a means to a higher growth. By having greater equity, you can have higher growth. You have greater inclusiveness, you have higher growth. One other colleague who has reinforced this whole argument, and was very, very relevant for those of you doing technological innovations and technology policies, is Professor Argyon at Harvard. And he has shown empirically that there is a positive relationship between innovations and long-term growth. He argues that the deeper the innovations and the broader the scope of innovations, the higher is your long-term growth. So in other words, long-term growth is critically dependent on innovations. The question is, and our brilliant colleague, young colleague here, Dr. Iza Aftab, has in fact done a PhD thesis on innovation in Pakistani manufacturing industry, and she would be able to tell us that innovation is the most important driving force in growth, but it is also the most important driving force in actualizing the creative potential of the people of a country. Because what is required if you want to innovate is the capacity for independent thinking. You have to be trained for original thinking, for thinking outside the box, of setting aside the received wisdom. Think for yourself. You cannot innovate unless you do that. And I would argue that innovation today is not only a matter of reaching higher growth rates, it's a matter of human survival. Look at the challenges we are facing. We are facing a planet whose life support systems are under threat. We've got to find the technologies which will prevent this catastrophe from taking place. We've got to find green technologies, and fast. You need innovation for that. You need innovative thinking to develop institutions in society and ways of doing things in society and forms of politics and social life in society so that you can reduce violence. Violence too undermines the great potential of society. And you have then also got to find innovative ways of designing a new trajectory of technological change. A technological change that is powering not just large-scale manufacturing industry with all the automation and so on, but a process of technological change, trajectory of technological change, which will increase the productivity and technological base of small firms, of your startups. How do we design technologies for them? And that's where the information technology sector comes in. You can design technologies, you can design forms of training, design forms of software where small startup firms can grow rapidly and have high levels of productivity and make an impact worldwide. So there's this innovation, I think, is one of the defining features of just being human, basically. The ability for creative thinking is linked up with this innovation business, and it has also been the means in the long run of human survival on the planet. Make no mistake about this, the planet and life itself on Earth is under threat, and we've got to be able to create a base of innovation and a trajectory of technological change through which we can survive and help other species to survive as well. One last thing that I thought I'd throw before you, as I said, it's more a series of provocations than anything else, and that is we've got to start rethinking what we really mean by development. For a long time it was thought that so long as per capita incomes are growing, you're developing. Development means increasing per capita incomes. Of course, there are various fashions, have better distribution of income, but the overall idea was that development means growth. Then Amartya Sen, the great professor, spent a summer at Trinity College in Cambridge. Sorry, it wasn't Oxford, it was at Cambridge. And he read Greek philosophy. And he came across a person who was writing in the 4th century BC by the name of Aristotle. And his book, which was available, called Nicomachean Ethics, contained a powerful passage which gripped Amartya's mind and freaked him out in modern terms. He just got freaked out. And what was that? Aristotle was dealing with the idea of value. ये value क्या चीज़ है? Economists भी इसी से deal करते हैं. What is value? And he says, goods cannot be of value because they're merely useful. Commodities cannot be of value because they're merely useful. What is of value is human functioning. अब ये सैन्य उठा लिया, human functioning. And he said, as an economist, economists are afraid of going into philosophy because they're afraid that they will be blackballed out of the economist community. And so Sen said, fine, okay, now what are the material conditions required for human beings to function? And he came up with simple things, and they had a chat. He had a chat with his old Cambridge colleague, Mahbub al-Haq, and they came up with this idea of human development. And he said that, well, basically what is required for human beings to function, and therefore for human development, is that people must get access over education, over good health facilities, obviously, and also, of course, over per capita income. So growth must take place, but it's a necessary but not a sufficient condition for development. Other factors are also important. There he goes into gender and freedom of the press and so on. So they derived, Mahbub al-Haq on that basis derived the Human Development Index, which was catapulted him into world fame, and which was a very, very valuable quantitative index to measure. This is another way of looking at development, measure human development as opposed to just growth. But one dimension which Sen and Huck and all the other economists looking at human development left out, I call it the missing dimension, was that they were not being fair to Aristotle. They didn't read the whole passage. They just got the first 3 sentences out of Nicomachean Ethics and not the remaining paragraph. I put the remaining paragraph on this slide. Have a look at this. पहले तो कहते हैं ना कि goods cannot be of value because they're merely useful. What is of value is human functioning. But then he says, what is of value is human functioning according to the principles of virtue. ये ह्यूमन फंक्शनिंग सिर्फ ये नहीं है कि रोटी पानी मिल जाए, हेल्थ और एजुकेशन हो जाए, जो हुसैन वगैरह ने कहा. ह्यूमन फंक्शनिंग मीन्स यू लीड अ पर्टिकुलर काइंड ऑफ लाइफ, मेक सर्टन चॉइसेस, जिसको नेकी की जिंदगी, दूसरों का ख्याल करना. Caring for others is a form of virtue. And he goes on to say that this sense of caring for others, this virtue, is part of the way, it's part of the logic of the soul. It's part of the logic of our consciousness. It's another kind of logic. एक तो लॉजिक है ना, A is equal to B and B is equal to C, A is equal to C, this syllogistic logic which some of the Greeks had introduced. But the other kind of logic is a logic of the human soul. ये उसको Socrates ने actually पहले बताया था, because one of the students of Socrates, Glucon I think it was, asked Socrates, Socrates, you keep telling us lead a life of virtue, lead a life of virtue. Why should I lead a life of virtue? When by deceiving other people, by nasty to other people, I can become a very rich man. And you know what Socrates said? Socrates said that if you lead a life of virtue, you benefit, you give pleasure to your soul. That's the missing dimension of human development. To develop the logic of the human soul, to develop the one dimension of human consciousness which may be unique to the human species. And that is the capacity to connect with the transcendent. God in His infinite mercy has given human beings qualities of His own. Two qualities which are particularly relevant here for our discussion is one, the quality of creativity, that human beings can create, can think for themselves. And second is the capacity for love, rahma. Rahm, Rahman or Rahim is a quality in terms of which God describes Himself most frequently in the Quran, Rahman or Rahim. The root of the term Rahm is Rahma. And you know what Rahma means in Arabic? The mother's womb. So God loves His creatures. And that capacity to love, to care, is a capacity that He has given to His vice-regents on earth, human beings. And that is why my argument is that as we face these historic challenges that are before us, of survival of the planet, of widespread violence, of inequality, the one quality that we must now begin to develop, which used to be developed by the ancients, by traditional wisdoms, and that quality is a quality of empathy, of compassion towards others. You can bring all the economics you like it to bear to argue that equality is good for growth and so on, but at the end of the day, to be able to build a more equal world, you've got to have empathy for those people who suffer, who are in pain. To build a less violent world, you've got to have the capacity to care, to love, to tolerate. So the driving force in many ways this aspect of, this forgotten aspect of consciousness, driving force of building a better world is to develop not just economies that are equitable, to develop not just new technologies and new innovation strategies for a better world, a safer world, but to develop this quality of the human being, the capacity to love and care, be tolerant, be peaceful. One of the ancients again, Sadi. He says, this gentleman writing is a Persian poet writing in the 13th century. ये आज की बात नहीं हम कह रहे, but कितनी relevant है आज की. वो कहता है, पर्शियन का मुझे इंग्लिश में ट्रांसलेशन मिली. O thou who hath no sorrow in seeing the sorrow of others. Thank you, my friend, who is also my teacher, Ali Aka Gardezi. He's the one who discovered this quote. O thou who hath no sorrow in seeing the sorrow of others, thou art not worthy of being called a human being. कि जो जिस बंदे के अंदर दूसरे का दुख ही नहीं है, उसको इंसान कहलाने का हक ही नहीं. This is the empathy that I was talking about, which is so basic. It's one of the defining features of being human. And we've lost that empathy. How else can we tolerate a world and economy which is systematically producing starvation, which is killing 90 people every hour through starvation or starvation-related diseases, while a few people are flying around on luxury airliners, playing golf on the airliner, aisles of the airliner, बहुत ऊपर खेल रहे होते. तो ये तभी हो सकता है कि अगर एम्पैथी नहीं है, आपको ख्याल ही नहीं है. We got to develop that. And that's the challenge of education. इकबाल, हम इकबाल को लिप सर्विस देते रहते हैं, बाकी we continue to do all the nasty things we possibly can to each other. You know, we kill each other. कि you got the wrong religion, you got the wrong version of religion. इसको मार दो, उसको मार दो. वो क्या कह रहा है यार? The founding father. He says, अरूज खाकी आदम के मुंतज़िर हैं तमाम, ये कहकशां, ये सितारे, ये नीलगूं अफलाक. He says that nature, God's creation, in which humans are the vice-regents, nature is awaiting the rise of man. This rise means actualizing the great human potential that God has given us to love and care, to create, to think. The rise of earthbound man is awaited by these mountains, these stars, these azure skies. And then he says, and this is something we put out in the IT Yoga, हमने motto बना लिया. Now the challenge is to translate this motto into institutions and rules and forms of education and ways of interacting with each other, so that you actualize this motto that you got on the board. क्या कहते हैं? जहान ताज़ा की अफकार ताज़ा से है नमूद. जहान ताज़ा की अफकार ताज़ा से है नमूद. That is to say, the emergence of new worlds is enabled by new ideas. So ladies and gentlemen, at a moment in history when violence is so widespread, when inequality is persisting, when empathy and love and care have been denuded from human consciousness, it is at this time that the founding fathers of this country become relevant. The world is awaiting the rise of man. And this rise of man, this actualizing of the great human potential, has these two dimensions. One, the ability for new ideas, which Akmal is talking about, innovate. And two, the capacity to love. I'll end there. Thank you.